guys, welcome back to Trellis and Trails Homestead. I'm Jacqueline. You guys have all been wanting a video of me making my sourdough loaves, just like a regular loaf. So we're gonna do that today. I'm gonna show you how I prepare our sourdough loaf, and then we'll bake it tomorrow. I'll bring you back for all of that. I'll put it in a full video here. But right now we're just gonna get started with adding our ingredients to the bowl to get our sourdough prepped and ready. Our starter, our flour, our water, our salt, and that's it. That's the great thing about sourdough. You don't need many ingredients to make a delicious loaf. So we're gonna start with our flour and water first. I like to mix that together. We'll let it sit for about 30 minutes to just autolyse. And then we'll come back to it and add our starter and our salt. So I have my bowl on my kitchen scale here. See there? So I'm just gonna tare it and zero it out. I do use a recipe for the most part. I modify recipes all the time just to make them more of my own based on what we like and our preferences of taste and texture and all of that. So I do use a recipe from Whispering Willow Farm. That is where I originally got my sourdough starter from 2 years ago. If you haven't checked her out on YouTube, Instagram, her website, make sure to go check her out, Jill, at Whispering Willow Farm. They are amazing. Her and her husband are great. So I've been really pleased with this sourdough starter. Like I said, I've had the exact same starter for 2 years now. I just put it in different mason jars and separate it out depending on how much I need. I do have a big jar now that I might add all of my starter to and just use it out of one big jar. Really pleased with this starter. I've even given some of it to friends and they've had good success with it. But yeah, it comes in dehydrated form. You just have to rehydrate it. She has all the instructions for that, and then you're able to use it. So my starter is very active after using the same 1 or 2 jars for the last 2 years. But it kind of takes a little bit to get it really, really active in the beginning. So let's go ahead and add our flour and our water. We're gonna do 500 grams of, I just use unbleached bread flour. I prefer to use bread flour. I know some people use all-purpose flour or whatever, but I feel like bread flour just helps with the texture of the sourdough. So we're gonna add 500 of flour. I'm a little bit over 514. You guys know that I try to be precise with measurements, but in the end, I'm really not. If it's over a little bit or even slightly under, it's fine. This loaf is just for my husband and I, so I've made them before where the flour or some of the measurements and ratios are just a little bit off, and still it turns out great, so not really worried about that. So I'm gonna zero my scale again. We're gonna add 300, the recipe calls for 350 grams of water. If you're just starting out making sourdough, I recommend following that recipe and adding just the 350 grams of water. I make my doughs a higher hydration dough, so I like to add a little bit of extra water to my doughs. I just feel like it helps with the texture and the density of the sourdough in the end. Just know that higher hydration loaves, once you get familiar with making sourdough and want to increase the hydration of them, they're a little harder to work with when you're like shaping and doing the stretch and folds and things like that. A little stickier in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it and learn exactly how to do the folding and the stretch and folds and like the dough forming, it gets a little easier, but it can be a little bit more challenging than just a regular sort of hydration level. So with all that being said, I'm gonna add a little bit more water. It says 350 grams in the recipe. I usually do about 380 or so. We're gonna add that now. So 387, which is actually perfect because I had 514 of flour, so that makes the ratios a little more precise. So I'm just gonna take this off the scale and mix this all together. I'm gonna set that aside for later. And actually you can mix it by hand. I also have this nifty little dough whisk, which is super, super nice. So sometimes I mix it initially with the dough whisk just to get the water kind of incorporated. And then to form like a shaggy dough, I'll continue to mix it by hand at that point. So you can see with the dough whisk, after you get the water incorporated, it becomes a little bit more challenging to continue to mix with that. So I'm just gonna take this out, get my dough off of here. I do have clean hands. I know you guys didn't see me wash them, but I promise I did. Set that aside. And then we'll continue to just kind of fold the flour and water in together to create a shaggy dough. So I didn't tell you guys, I fed my sourdough starter last night. My starter in my jar, there's usually about 50 or so in here at any given time once I like use it or pour off the discard or whatever. So I like to start with 50 of starter, and then when I'm feeding it, like the night before I'm mixing up the dough, I add 50 grams of bread flour, this one here, and 50 grams of filtered water. I just use the water out of my freezer door. I feel like that's filtered enough since I changed the filter. So I did do that last night, got that all ready. You're supposed to use it is advised that you use your sourdough starter at its peak. And what that means is when this rises to its maximum amount, and you'll figure out when that is, like based on hours, once you start working with it. The time is variable and it's dependent on a lot of different factors. How cold or warm it is in your house, kind of where you have it sitting. Temperature affects it greatly. So my house is pretty much always on the cool side. It's usually about 68 degrees in here at any given time. If you need it to be in like a warmer spot or help it rise quicker, things like that, you can put it in the oven, like make sure the oven is off and toss it in there where it's kind of generally a little bit warmer, or beside the fridge or kind of near an appliance that, you know, runs, where the ambient temperature is a little bit warmer. I just sit it on my counter kind of over there. Honestly, it's kind of by the window and I don't have a problem with it. Also, I don't mind a little bit of a longer rise time because I fed it at 9 p.m. last night and then I went to bed for 11 hours basically. So it's gonna rise to its peak before 11 hours in my house. It usually takes about 8 hours to get it to its highest peak here. So I don't keep like a rubber band or anything around my jar. You can do that when you're first starting out just to see, put your stuff in a clean jar and then put a rubber band around it and then you'll be able to see how far it rises. I don't really worry too much about it. Also, I'm here to tell you, do what you will with this information. Once you get the hang of sourdough, you'll kind of figure out that you don't have to use it exactly at its highest peak. It is still very, very active after the 8-hour mark once it starts to drop down. It does not affect the rise time, the doubling, the baking part, or the texture or anything with my end loaf. I don't have any problems with not using it at its peak. Now, I don't use it many hours or, you know, a day or so after its peak. At that point, it's just discard because you want to use it when it's bubbly and active. So let me wash my hands and I'll open this because I haven't opened it yet since I fed it last night, and we'll see how bubbly and active it is. Okay, so real quick, I mixed up the flour and water, and you can see we have like a pretty shaggy dough here. It doesn't have to be in any form or shape right now because we still have to add our starter and our salt. So we're gonna just let this rest and autolyse for about 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and add the starter and the water to it. I'm just gonna cover it with a towel. This is not a damp towel right now. After we do the stretch and folds, in between the stretch and folds, and once we let it rest later for 8 hours or so, we'll put a damp cloth on it because we don't want it to dry out. But since I'm gonna come back in just a little bit anyways, we can just cover it with a regular towel. Let's see how our sourdough looks. Look at that. Can you see all the bubbles? The active bacteria in there. So this is very active. My cat is running through the house. This is very active, very live sourdough. Probably not at its peak. Its peak was probably just, you know, slightly higher last night at some point, the 8-hour mark or so, but it is still very, very active, very, very full. And I have no problem using this for my loaf today. So when we come back in 30 minutes, we'll go ahead and add this in and our salt. You can add the salt directly into the loaf. I find that the salt is a little more incorporated when I just let this sit in a little bit of water to kind of like dissolve and then just pour it in. So that does add a little bit of extra water, right? But it's usually no more than like 15 or 20 grams, if that. So I'm gonna pour out 12 grams of salt into just a little cup. Just add a tiny bit of water to it, and we're gonna let that sit until we come back and add it in 30 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna bring you guys back in for adding our salt and sourdough to our prepared dough here. Still have our shaggy dough, so I'm just gonna pop this on the scale and we're gonna zero it out again. All right, so I have my salt mixture here and a little bit of water. It ended up being 20 grams of water, and that's okay. I don't mind adding a little extra water to my loaves. So let me just mix this together real quick. Just wanted that salt to dissolve a little bit before I add it to the bread. Like I said, I just feel like it incorporates a little better when it's a little bit more dissolved. It's coarse kosher salt, so it's not gonna be completely dissolved, but it's been sitting in the water for the entire 30 minutes, so it's pretty well dissolved. Okay, so I have my bowl zeroed. We're gonna add 100 grams of starter. If I have a little bit more in here, then I tend to add a little bit more. I don't mind the sour taste of the sourdough, so we'll see how much we have. So that's about 110, and we still have probably 50 or 60 grams left in here. So we'll go with that, 110. And then I had already measured out the 12 grams of salt. It was about 13. We're gonna pour that in. All right, and now we're gonna mix this all together. I just washed my hands, all clean. So I usually just kind of fold it in, almost similar to doing a little bit of a stretch and fold, but just incorporate that together really well. I feel like the texture of this dough is already really, really good. Getting not quite elastic. You can see it's still kind of hard for me to tug on a little bit, but definitely a pretty firm, manageable dough. And now we let it sit for another half hour, let some of the gluten structure form, let everything start fermenting together. So then we'll come back and we'll do stretch and folds. It's been 30 minutes, so we're gonna start our first stretch and fold here on our bread. It's been sitting with the salt and the sourdough starter in it, just kind of fermenting in here. So we're gonna start our stretch and folds. I'm gonna do a round of stretch and folds every 30 minutes for 2 hours. And then we're gonna let it sit just like undisturbed at room temperature for probably about 8 hours. And I'll bring you back tonight to do like a pre-shape. I'm probably gonna put, I haven't decided yet if I'm gonna do a rosemary garlic loaf or a jalapeno cheddar for us. I'll decide that in the meantime, and then I'll go ahead and put all that stuff in it when I do the pre-shape, and then we'll probably stick it in the fridge overnight. So let's go ahead and start with our stretch and folds. So you want it to be easily released from the sides of the bowl. That's one of the intentions with the stretch and folds. Also, to develop the gluten structure, the stretching and folding really helps form that gluten and really creates the texture of the loaf. So I do 1 full circle motion and kind of fold it all together. And you can see it's kind of falling apart a little bit. That's because we need to develop the structure of it. So it's going to do that until the gluten forms and it's more in a loaf shape. All right, so again, we'll cover this, let it sit for another 30 minutes. I'll come back and do another stretch and fold. All right, so we are going to do another stretch and fold. It's been 30 minutes. This is our second stretch and fold, and we'll see how our dough is forming. After one full turn of stretch and folds, this is what we now have. You can see it's not falling apart as easily or wanting to fall back towards the sides of the bowl. It's more in like an actual dough form. So that's what we want. That means the gluten is forming, the texture is developing. So that looks really, really good. So we'll cover it again for 30 minutes and come back at 12:30, do another stretch and fold. Then we'll do the last one at 1 o'clock and then we'll let it sit for a while. So we're gonna do our third stretch and fold now. Oh, look at that. It's like very stretchy now. That's what you want. You're able to pull it right off the sides, give it a good stretch, fold it over. It's looking more and more dough shaped every single time, which is great. So one more. All right, our last stretch and fold. I'm a little bit late on this, but that's okay. So you can really see how elastic the dough is now. Like my stretches are pretty easy to do. It's peeling right off the sides of the bowl. That's what you want. Let's do one more round. Cool. So we're just gonna let this sit for about 8 hours or so. I'll bring you back when we put this stuff in the inside, whether it's rosemary, garlic, or jalapeno cheddar. I haven't decided yet, but I'll bring you back to that process and I'll show you how I stuff it, and then we'll let it relax and rest overnight. Okay friends, I did let the bread sit for 8 hours, but I did not come back on this night to put the toppings inside. I was so tired. I've been baking sourdough all week and I was exhausted. So if it looks like I'm struggling in the rest of this video, I was very tired. I went to bed early this night. So this is me just the next morning taking the bread out of the refrigerator. And then stretching it out to get ready to put the cheese and jalapeno inside. So that's what we decided on. That is our favorite loaf to make. A lot of times instead of cheddar cheese, I'll use a red pepper Gruyere cheese. That's our absolute favorite. But today, as you see, I am putting the cheddar cheese in throughout the dough. I like to kind of stretch the edges and make sure that I cover the entire surface of the dough with the cheese. So you'll see that here. And then as soon as we have it all covered in cheese, I'm placing jalapenos. A lot of times, especially if I'm cooking this for other people, I'll chop the jalapenos up. But for us, we don't mind the whole pieces of jalapenos, so I'm just sticking those right in. And then you'll see I'm just kind of pulling the edges towards the middle, folding it all together into a complete circle. And then once we're done with that, we'll fold it into a ball shape. So we'll fold it over onto itself and then kind of tuck the edges under. We'll pull it against the mat. You want to kind of create some friction on the bottom. So I'm doing that as best as I can on a mat. It's definitely easier to do on a counter surface, but I like to use my mat just for easier cleanup. We're just going to dust the top of the loaf with flour, kind of get it into a round ball shape, and then here it is as it's resting for about 20 minutes before I toss it into the oven. We're just going to let it sit since it just came out of the refrigerator. So I have my banneton here. Ideally, I would have done this last night. I would have floured the banneton really well, put my loaf in it upside down, and kept it in the refrigerator in the banneton overnight. Since we didn't, form it into the ball and go ahead and stuff it, I just left it in the bowl that it was in. I have my Dutch oven in the oven preheating. I like to preheat my oven to 500 degrees, and that's with the Dutch oven in there. And just like get the Dutch oven as hot as possible. And then I'll bump the temperature down to 450 to do the actual baking. But I just like to get the oven as hot as possible, the Dutch oven as hot as possible before I put the bread in there. So while that's preheating, I have my loaf in the fridge, still in the Banneton. I just wanted to pop it in there for a few. This is getting going because it's easier to score your bread while it's cold. So I know that we left it on the counter at room temp to proof for about an hour and a half. So really 2 hours is a good time frame to proof your sourdough on the counter if you're gonna just proof it at room temp, or you can stick it in the fridge overnight. Cool temperature of the fridge just slows down the proofing so that it doesn't overproof, because then you'll have a weird texture, kind of like a gummy inside, and it'll affect your crust. So you never want to overproof your bread. So I had it in the fridge overnight proofing, and then we took it out this morning, did the 2 hours on the counter after we did the initial shaping. You're supposed to do like a final shaping. I kind of just like rounded it as much as possible before I placed it into the Banneton. You can't really do so much of a final shape once you add ingredients to the inside. So since I added the cheese and the jalapenos to the inside, I can't go back in and do a full reshape like you would do with a plain loaf that doesn't have anything in it. So I just kind of make sure that it's as round as possible before I placed it into the Banneton, and it should be fine. That way I've never had a problem with it before. So I'm gonna get that out of the fridge, place it on some parchment paper, and go ahead and score it. And then by that time, our oven should be warm enough. We can go ahead and toss it in there and start the baking. I'm just gonna set these sourdough jars here to kind of hold it down. So we're gonna flour this really well. It doesn't have to be floured too much. It's parchment paper, it's not gonna stick to it, but I just like to add a little bit of flour to it before I place the dough down. We let this rise and proof in our Banneton for about an hour and a half. I'm gonna dump it upside down onto the parchment paper, and then we'll score the top of it. You can see it has a pretty good texture. It's cool because it was in the fridge. We're just gonna empty it upside down. So if your Banneton is floured really well, it shouldn't stick. You can see there's kind of some indentation from the Banneton itself, and that is fine. I'm just gonna kind of push it together so it's pretty firm before we get ready to put it in the Dutch oven, and it'll still maintain its shape. Flouring the top, once you score it, it'll make your pattern show up better and your crust a little more crispy. So to have it floured, I have my bread lame here. This is what we're gonna use to score it with. Super sharp, so just be real careful with it. It works best when this is wet, so I'm just gonna run it under some water for a second. If you wanna have a good ear, I kind of suggest starting from like the top and going straight down the middle here and do a pretty deep indentation. I think a good like inch or so is where you wanna be. I have, you can kind of see, maybe you can see that, my jalapeno there, and you can see my cheese. This stuff doesn't really like pop out. It stays in there once you bake it. So with the scoring and scoring it deep, it's really fine. So I just like for that to be pretty deep there. And then I like to go in with some like more shallow slash marks to create that sort of like flowery leaf looking pattern. And I don't worry about being too close to this score mark because this is gonna kind of expand open anyway. So if you don't do it close to your score marking, your pattern is gonna be like on the side of the bread. So as close as you can get it to the ear part, the middle score, works out the best I've found. So I'm gonna do a couple on this side too. These are probably like 3/4 of an inch slash marks here, a good inch or so for the middle one to get that good crispy ear. That's kind of our favorite part. I'm just gonna do these kind of all the way down. I am not a professional when it comes to scoring bread. I know there's lots of intricate, beautiful patterns out there, and I have not figured them out yet. So I kind of just do the basics and what works, and it still turns out gorgeous every time. So we have enough flour on here. I don't reflour it at this point because that will affect the way that your pattern looks once it bakes. So we just want all of this stuff to be really good and crispy. I'm just gonna make these slightly deeper. You don't want these too deep because they'll kind of expand and open up too if they are too deep. So you just want more shallow marks for your pattern. All right, our oven is heated to 500 degrees. I'm gonna turn it down to 450 for baking. This is super, super hot, so just make sure you're using your pot holders. And then I just pick the parchment up and toss it in here. I try to make sure my parchment isn't bended over the loaf because it'll cause indentations in it. So I try to make sure it's like as even as possible in the Dutch oven. Just being really careful not to touch the sides, of course. So yeah, I have most of like the folds and everything out of the inside, so that should bake up pretty well. This is gonna expand pretty largely. You can see there's not really a lot of room on the sides because our loaf was already pretty wide, so it'll just rise up, which is exactly what we want. So I'm gonna put the lid on. Then we're gonna toss it in the oven. So we're gonna bake that for about 30 minutes on 450 degrees with the lid on. And then we'll take the lid off and bake it for another about 30. Sometimes after the basically full hour in the oven, if it still needs to crisp up a little bit on the top, then I'll leave it with the lid off and bake it for a few minutes longer. But it never really goes more than maybe 10 minutes or so over the hour. I do live at elevation, so that affects my baking time. If you live at sea level, you probably won't have that problem, and you can probably even bake it for like 50 minutes. I would start with 50 and kind of go from there. So I would do 25 with the lid on and then 25 with the lid off and see what kind of results you get. You can play along with the baking techniques and times and whether you want the lid on for longer versus the lid off for longer. Do what works best once you start experimenting with your baking. That's just what works best for me. And so we're gonna give it the 25 minutes and then we'll take the lid off. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today and baking our sourdough loaf. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it, just from like a beginner sourdough standpoint. Just remember that you don't have to follow all the rules so closely. Your loaf will still turn out delicious either way. So let me know how you like this video. Comment below if you try your own sourdough loaf, if you're a beginner sourdough baker, and let me know what works for you, what doesn't work for you, if you've tried some things that are a little against the rules or the recipe and it still turned out okay. I'd love to hear those, so let me know. Like, subscribe, send all your friends to my channel. I really appreciate you guys for being here and can't wait to see you next time. Bye!